We are back, and we are joined now by Rebecca Jane Morgan, author of Gender Heretics, Evangelicals, Feminists, and the Alliance Against Trans Liberation. Rebecca, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you because I've been on a war against TERFs for a little bit here on this program. Gotten a little heated on that front, so I have,
She's looking to ground herself.
Yes, I have immense anger towards them, obviously, for being transphobic. And so what might be helpful is for you and your expertise to trace the origin of them. And then also, they're kind of seemingly anachronistic based on their other stated beliefs, alliance with evangelicals. So let's just start with some simple definitions for people in the audience that may not be familiar. What is a TERF, and how did that moniker come to be?
Sure, yeah. So a TERF is an acronym. It stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist. It was coined in 2008 by a feminist blogger who was just trying to find a term that was sort of easy to use to describe people who self-identify as feminists but don't include trans people. So that's where it comes from. There's a lot of debate about whether it's a good term or not. Personally, I don't think it is. I don't think there's any problem with using it, just it's not very accurate. Primarily because, well, number one, a lot of these people, unfortunately, are not looking to just exclude trans people. They're looking to exterminate trans people. And number two, a lot of them are not radical feminists, and many of them aren't even feminists at all. So there we go.
Yeah, I mean, so why do they call themselves radical? And are they only radical in the fact that they hate trans people and they find that to be subversive? Because radical feminist theory would eschew, and I would imagine does eschew, these kinds of folks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there used to be a myth that in the 1970s, radical feminism was sort of uniquely transphobic. But actually, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of radical feminists at the time were specifically trans-inclusive. And there were many trans people who were themselves radical feminists. I think there's debate about why radical feminism specifically seems to be so closely related with transphobia. Part of it is just the fact that trans visibility was rising at exactly the time that radical feminism was becoming more of a thing in the 70s. So I think there were problems in feminist theory, issues about how do we define what a woman even is, that have been around for centuries. It was just that in the 70s, radical feminists came along. They were very irreverent, very willing to be, in people's faces. And unfortunately, that was the same time when trans identities were becoming into the popular mainstream.
And the evangelical piece. I mean, you are a Christian yourself. What inspired you, I guess, to analyze this connection between evangelicals and TERFs?
Oh yeah. So I mean, the main thing that motivated me was the fact that in evangelical literature on this subject, almost all of it references TERF literature, or so-called gender critical literature, anti-trans literature, basically. So I was really interested in that because, I mean, a lot of the people who are writing this anti-trans doctrine are very different to a radical feminist on other issues, say like reproductive rights. So it's a strange sort of combination. So yeah, I really wanted to know where that came from, why that alliance specifically exists, and also what effect it's had on evangelical beliefs about this subject. So yeah.
Yeah, and you do such a wonderful job of like explaining the theology to someone like me, who's not religious at all, and I want to get into that for sure. But what surprised me is just how you look at and trace what the history of evangelical opposition to trans rights really goes back to and when it started. And I was surprised to see certain quotes supportive of trans people from Christian and evangelical ministers in the 60s and 70s. So what is that history, and when did it really kind of shift so rapidly?
Yeah. So, if anyone, for anyone in the audience who's already sort of familiar with the history of the so-called moral majority in America, the Christian right, and particularly its relationship with reproductive rights, the history of evangelicalism and trans identity kind of has a similar trajectory. So, in the early 70s and late 60s, a lot of evangelicals were very either ambivalent towards abortion or pro-choice. And it was only later that this impression that evangelical theology automatically leads to super conservative views came along. The same is true with trans issues. So in 1966, Johns Hopkins University performed the first what was then called a sex change in its facility, not the first ever, but the first at that facility. And a local journalist actually decided, for some reason, I don't know why, that they were going to go around all the local religious leaders and ask what they think about this surgery. I think there was 14 of them. So, Catholics, all sorts of Protestant ministers. 13 of them either had a mixed or positive perspective, including the local Southern Baptist minister. A guy called Roy Gresham, who said simply, "This is an area of medical science and not morally prohibitive." That's his quote. So, and that continues into the early 70s. It's 1971. Another Southern Baptist minister called David Edens says that he has worked with some trans people as a counselor, and says he recognizes in them a similar transformation to the transformation he sees in rebirth, the Christian idea of being born again. And he says we need to use our medical knowledge, our skills to improve the lives of everyone, including trans people. And in Oklahoma, the Baptist General Hospital in Oklahoma City was one of the regional hubs for so-called sex change surgery at this time. It was only banned in 1977. When there was still dissent on the board of the local Baptist convention about whether this was good or not. So yeah, this idea that if you're an evangelical you have to be transphobic is really quite recent. And just one last sort of quote to illustrate the point. Pat Robertson, one of the
We
most
played this. We played this on our show. Yeah.
Yeah, in 2013, and it also happened in 2001. But in 2013, he says, an audience member sent in a question about this issue, and his co-host is like visibly anti-trans, and he just says it's not for you to decide or judge. And it's only later that he retracts that statement because of pressure from other conservative leaders. So fundamentally, yeah, there's nothing in evangelical theology, and this is one of the big arguments I make in the book. There's nothing in evangelical theology that leads automatically to transphobia. It's something that's exerted on it from outside.
So when's the moment that you see it really have this kind of massive change?
Well, it depends on the country. I mean, here in the UK, it really changed around sort of the early 2000s when we had something called the Gender Recognition Act going through Parliament. So the Evangelical Alliance, which is our biggest evangelical group, hadn't said anything, almost nothing about trans issues until this proposition came along. And then all of a sudden, they started to really pay attention to some super conservative American and British theologians. So they positioned themselves sort of against the Gender Recognition Act. But interestingly, part of why they did that isn't because they particularly cared about trans issues. It was because the Gender Recognition Act, in its early stages, potentially would have created some same-sex marriages. It was just a side effect of that. So that was the thing that really got them sort of worked up. So that's kind of when it starts to kick off in the UK. In the US, it depends. A lot of it doesn't even happen until the 2010s.
Right, right. With the bathroom bills.
with the bathroom bills, with the the sports stuff, um, all sorts of issues that just suddenly come along in the mid to late 2010s. Gamergate played a bit of a role in this. Transphobic memes online kind of kicked off during and after Gamergate. But the point is, it's really recent, and if it's recent, that prompts the question: well, is it really going to stay that long? Can we fix it? And it's difficult, but I think there are signs that we can.
Well, we've talked about this in this program, at least in terms of like the electoral salience of this. At Germentum has a great piece, but it's just the Republicans that are running on transphobia are like have not done well electorally. It's just not something that resonates with people, and I guess that's a semblance of hope on this front.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're losing battles that they electoral battles that they really should be winning right now at this point in the electoral cycle. Same here in the UK. I mean, the Conservative Party, which has really been leaning into transphobia, is like 15, 20 points behind in the polls. I mean, it's not working.
Yeah.
And that points to, I think, something really important about this is that the transphobic rhetoric is a tactic. It's not a strategy. It's about consolidating their base, getting their base fired up. But in the long term, it's really repulsive to a lot of people, including conservatives. In the US and the UK, polling data seems to suggest that a lot of young evangelicals are just either moving more in a progressive direction or really just don't care.
Yeah.
So it's not a long-term strategy, and they will have to move on from it at some point. The downside of that, of course, is that when they move on from trans people, they'll go back to someone else. Maybe they'll go back to, my guess is they'll probably go back to primarily anti-Muslim, anti-Mexican rhetoric, the border. But yeah, it's not working, and they will have to move on.